This is Sg2 Perspectives, a conversation with Sg2 experts and industry thought leaders about the biggest trends in healthcare and what we expect that's going to mean for the future of healthcare delivery.
What is nice about the tools that Sg2 brings is often they're convening tools for stakeholders. They are such great ways to get the right people around the table, especially if they have different backgrounds, and say, let's focus on this one thing together.
Welcome to Sg2 Perspectives. I'm your host, Jayme Zage. As the population ages, we expect rising prevalences of chronic medical conditions, and as a result, rising demand for treatments and interventions. This demand and the ability to meet it will be challenged by our ongoing capacity constraints. Building should not be the first line of defense. Joining me today is my colleague, Josh Aaker, who leads our CV services, but does a lot of other things when it comes to capacity. Maybe we'll dig into CV a little bit as an example, but we'll also talk generally how organizations can plan differently to manage that capacity. Thanks for joining me today, Josh.
Well, thanks for having me, Jayme. I'm excited to have this conversation. When I think about some of the strategic planning questions, this is really ultimately at the heart of what they're asking. What am I doing with the resources that I have? Because I probably won't be given more resources in the future.
Whether it's facility or specialists, we are dealing with a finite set of resources. Let's set the stage in terms of what that general healthcare landscape is. What does that demand growth look like over the next 10 years? And how does that impact our planning?
One of the nice things at Sg2 is we are able to tap into our forecast, but also our Vizient data resources. Just looking at some of the recent quarterly data from the Vizient clinical database, we've seen that inpatient volumes have gone up about 13% from 2020 to 2025. We also know that observation and ED volumes have also gone up. We're getting better. Average length of stay is going down. Observation length of stay is going down. ED length is going down. We are getting operationally and clinically, and I hope quality, better. We just know that there is not only a growth, but it's that aging of the population that is causing us a lot of resource constraints up and down the system of care. When you look broadly at our Sg2 forecast for the next decade, we're anticipating about a 5% growth on the inpatient side and around 18% growth on the outpatient side. Put that into perspective of what you are doing today is going to increase and ramp up over the next decade because of the aging, the higher acuity. The easiest way to think about this is the rising chronicness of disease. As many times we see those GLP-1 commercials, why are we seeing them? Diabetes, congestive heart disease, cardiovascular disease. Paying attention of the chronic disease landscape is a good indicator of how and who is going to be coming into our finite resources that are physically bound, and also the resources that need to support that, like the workforce.
Over the last decade, we see lots of care shifts. Some of them are surgical interventions becoming medical. Some are medical interventions now leaning more towards surgical. We're seeing some of the care shift to alternative sites besides that inpatient, which is why we see the outpatient growing faster than the inpatient. Maybe put your CV hat on as our example here. How are the shift in these procedures going to be delivered with this rising demand? How have these changes impacted the capacity of the key CV facilities? And what is it going to look like in the next couple of years?
We don't even need to think about the next couple of years. The problem is now. When we did our webinar last year, there was about 200 people on the phone, asked just a general question of where and do you have capacity constraints? 4 people said that they did not. Now, some of them had constraints at the ED level or the specialist E&M level, or were worried about PCPs or the procedural space. Everyone has their own problem, or often all of them together, depending on where you are. But you had talked about what that clinical innovation is doing. First of all, the Sg2 Impact of Change forecast is based on this exact issue. It started as a conversation between Cabbage and PCI. The forecast is the CV service lines have a very special affinity to it. But then you can see now we've even replaced some of that cardiac intervention with medications and the anti-PCSK9s and statins, and we no longer have smoking as prevalent. The new clinical innovation is the expansion of the ASC covered procedure list from CMS. Broadly, we all know that this has been happening. We've seen it happen in orthopedics over the years. I tell all the C-suite listeners what happened in ortho is not necessarily going to happen in CV. That doesn't mean we shouldn't plan for things. This ASC covered procedure list allows us to open up the question that we're having. If we have capacity constraints, are we going to build our way out of it? If we're going to build, do you build in the middle of the campus, which is probably the highest cost per square foot? It's right next to the surgery bay. It's right next to where the nurses are. Can you build on the edge of campus? So you're further away. It's maybe easier access. Or what this now opens up is, can you build it across the street? Great that we have more options, but that actually makes strategic planning that much more challenging and difficult. Broadly, we know we're getting a rise in population and chronic disease. That's the CV population. That's what's coming in. We're anticipating even higher than the overall forecast in CV overall. And we know that the labs are a capacity constraint, particularly as we are adopting more and more of the transcatheter valve replacements, some of them actually in the Cath Lab. So now the Cath Lab is this intersection of all this busy activity, increased demand, but then you raise the question, how are we going to get our way out of this? So where does SG2 come in? We got to build tools. Jayme, you've had a long history at SG2. How have we used them in the past?
I think I built the first one, which was a stereotactic radiosurgery calculator. That was a new technology. And what does it mean? And what is your volumes? And who's going to be appropriate? You had the single session devices, and then you had the multi-session devices. And how do you strategically plan between them? We've seen tools be fundamental to taking different scenarios of information, data that we have. We don't know everything, especially when we're looking to the future, and saying, what do we need to do if we have X or if we have Y? And how does that change our capacity or our finances as a result? And sometimes we want to add a program or we want to add a provider. Do we have the capacity to add that provider given how we're operating today? Then I think, Josh, we have also started to look at the operations piece. Are we maximizing the efficiencies of our resources? Are our specialists seeing enough patients? Are our facilities getting the throughput that we would expect to optimize both revenue and performance?
It goes back to some of the topics that were discussed at the 3-year ahead of leveraging your service line. We have to operate both on the inpatient, on the outpatient, virtual, at home. What is a lever that you can use to communicate up and down that? And it's because where the service line is, strategy meets operations. We are the front-facing line of the organization. So we better be carrying the strategy that you all want us to. We often think about how can we turn some of our strategic insights into actionable materials for our clients. And one of the ways that I like to think about it is we're using the scenario planners. So if you ever hear me say calculator for the rest of this, I really mean scenario planner. What does a scenario planner look like? For us, we're having challenges with the demand for transcatheter valve replacement in the triple digits for many of our clients. The demand is just huge. But we have a finite number of Cath Labs. Also, you're forecasting a decline in diagnostic catheterization, which is in the Cath Lab, and we're replacing it with cardiac imaging. Cardiac imaging is also required for those transcatheter procedures. All of these intersections are really challenging and confusing. How do I put them all together? And that's where this tool came from. It was an evolution of a tool that we've had on our website for quite a while, but now we wanted to update it to embrace the clinical innovation you had mentioned. What does that site of care shift look like? We can take this environmental scenario planner, throw in your data. You can change all sorts of buckets. But what is nice is there's a visual depiction of what is the overall utilization that is going to be in your Cath Lab. And then you can flip some buttons and say, what if we were to build an ASC? Or what if we build a Cath Lab? What are the ultimate changes of the Cath Lab case mixes that are in there? And what does that utilization look like now and 5 years in the future? It's that environmental scenario planner of what do we want to do and what is that going to look like? It's so much more than that, but that's where we started out when we developed the tool.
That's great. It used to just be those cardiac caths. That was all you were doing in the Cath Lab. That's why it's called the Cath Lab. But now as we move other procedures there that are from a 30-minute procedure now to a 4-hour procedure and everything in between, the challenge of creating efficient operations for something that had been incredibly efficient, you start to see those efficiencies diminish. And it becomes almost like operating an OR. Because it is highly variable. You have to change things out. It's got different equipment, all of those different kinds of things to come into play.
Exactly the way you're framing this, because we all have subscription services and we start to realize after a couple of years, this is really costly when you think about it. Now, all the cardiac procedures that we're doing have these really high cost devices. And those devices surely aren't coming down in price, unfortunately. As we replace some of these diagnostic cath with now device-intensive procedures like the transcatheter valve procedures, it's really device-intensive. And so that dollar per minute in a cath lab is now important. Healthcare is only going to become more challenging in the future. What are some ways that we can simplify the discussion and get that speed to market for strategy folks up and down the organizations that we work with?
We talked about the tool that you've got on the SG2 website. What else do they need to bring into the conversation that they're having internally to strategize? Beyond volume clarity, case mix, what are some of the other things that they need to be thinking about in terms of how they plan for the future of CV OR, CV Cath Lab, CV office, imaging center?
It helps it make it real. Let's make it tangible. That's why this is about all ORs or your ED department or your kitchen on site. Are we doing the best with the limited resources that we all have? Let's focus on the Cath Lab. What is nice about the tools that SG2 brings is often they're convening tools for stakeholders. I think about our basic to comprehensives, about our system of cares. They are such great ways to get the right people around the table, especially if they have different backgrounds, and say, let's focus on this one thing together. First of all, the environmental scenario planner, this Cath Lab calculator, brings everyone in the room around a formal document. I've even started conversations where it's like, well, how many cath labs do you have? And there will be a difference in the answer of we have 3. No, we have 4. No, that one's going down. It started back up. Well, remember that IR has this book. We even have a disagreement of what our starting is, let alone where our journey is and how we're going to get there. I love that it immediately brings people together and has a real rational discussion. What is going on today? And then what are the assumptions going on tomorrow? And do we agree with them? That's great. That's how we intended this. I've seen people take all of our products, and I love them dearly, rip them to shreds and rebuild them only stronger to help suit their needs. I've seen a ton of different examples. Ultimately, it's a fantastic way. You don't have to agree or disagree, but let's focus on this one conversation together. And this is a tool by which we can do that. We have supercharged it with data and insights around the Cath Lab and transcatheter valve. We have multiple documents, both training and the rising tide of CV disease that helps support why did this document or this scenario planner come about. It's a great way to communicate with your operations or financial or strategy folks. How do you use tools that are going to start blending those all together? Because that's the world that we're living in.
To deal with our capacity issue, if no, we can't build, let's just assume that's off the table to start with. It's about using our data, thinking about and strategizing the right mix of patients that we can manage within the capacity that we have. It's really about efficiencies, and data is how we understand whether or not we are efficient and how we can get more efficient and where we should invest our resources.
What powers not only the forecast, the SG2 Impact of Change forecast powers this document, but also we have Vizient data, real data that powers this from our procedural analytics. It's a really powerful tool. So we have the actual average minutes per case. You were talking about operations, and this is where sometimes strategy can assume things are going well. With cases in all sorts of rooms, you have to transition between them. You got to turn that around. That can be challenging. We've put in the average time that we have heard is 35 minutes. I say that to clients and they chuckle of like, I would pay to get down to 35 minutes. I have been showing this scenario planner around in one organization, all of their 300 plus Cath Labs they're using this tool for. But the other ones that I've been having conversations that I found really powerful is not only how they've evolved the tool to meet their needs, but to have a conversation of how do we get down to 35 minutes? One organization said, we tell them if you turn this around in this X amount of time, you'll get a bonus. Another organization said, we let everyone leave early if they finish all their cases by time. And when I bring that up to other clients, they said, I guess we've never really incented them to turn this around. Well, then how are you going to make sure that you're optimizing your resources? This goes back into, are you again communicating with the people about your strategy? And if you want everyone to row together to get more of our patients through at a better, quicker, faster, healthier way, are you telling them that? And are you giving them the opportunity to express that and get a share of the winnings? This is a Cath Lab calculator, and yet it is so much more when you get the people around there, especially the voices of operations, strategy, and financials.
Quality too. Thank you, Josh. I really appreciate the time that we have where we can exchange thoughts and ideas. I always find it invigorating. It gets me all excited. And I hope for Sg2 Perspective listeners that it's gotten them excited too about thinking differently about how they can address some of their capacity issues so they can grow and meet the demand for services to come. So thank you, Josh, and thank you, listeners.
Thanks for listening. If you like this episode, please subscribe, rate, and review us, and or follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn at Sg2 Healthcare. And if you want to talk more about innovative healthcare strategies, you can always email me at sg2perspectives@sg2.com. Finally, Sg2 is a Vizient company, and there are a bunch of Vizient podcasts that you might like. You can find them at Vizient /podcasts. Have a great day.